I'm Jessica.
I'm Terry.
And we are from Stitchhouse here in Plano, Texas, right, Terry?
Yeah.
Do you know where you are?
Yes. I'm ready to go.
What are we going to do today, Terry?
Today we're going to use the serger to actually put our binding on our quilt samples and also use the fusible thread to show you a different way to finish.
I think that's really cool. Terry came up with this idea. We're using a Floriani fusible thread. I'll show you guys a little sample of it. The fusible thread, is that new, Terry?
I think essentially I've heard about it, but it's never really been as quality as this one. You can actually still see it from where you're at. And normally some of that fusible thread is so thin that it doesn't really hold as well.
Like a monofilament or something.
Almost as small as a monofilament.
So we came up with this idea to use Terry came up with the idea to use the fusible thread a few weeks ago, and then we got the new BERNINA 890 sergers in, and they're so simple to thread because they're air threading. And Terry's going to show you exactly how to attach your binding to your quilt, and then actually use the fusible thread as a way to kind of adhere the binding to the quilt. So if you're going to go back and top stitch it, or if you're going to hand stitch onto the back, or however you do it, that's up to you after you get your binding onto the quilt. Why do you like binding your binding to the quilt using a serger?
There's a couple different reasons. I think the most important part is if you're suffer from OCD and you don't like all those little strings getting caught inside your seam, as you're surging along, it actually cuts all those little threads off of there. The other thing is that it does do a 1/4 inch wide seam, and so you're able to have a nice flat tight edge of your quilt under your binding. And that's a lot of things that the big quilters look at first, is how you've done your binding and
how tight it is, how tight you can get it too. And then I think it just is nice to have a finished and secured seam underneath that binding there, so that all of your layers, your top, your batting, your backing, are all secured together in one nice swoop. And you can do that with the serger.
Yeah.
Anything else you like to do for quilting with a serger?
That's going to be coming. But so there's a difference between piecing and quilting, and all quilters know that when we say quilter, it's that whole encompassing thing. But there are people who love to piece, and there are people who love to quilt.
Which one do you love?
I love using the quilting machines, but did you know that this can be a quilting machine also?
Really?
And so eventually, maybe she'll let me do it.
Maybe we'll have time, is what he's trying to say.
But you can actually use this to do different chain stitches, cover stitches, and using decorative threads to actually do the quilting on your quilt.
That's super cool.
And because of this large open space, you are able to roll your quilt up in there a little bit.
Not all sergers have this large space. A lot of them, like the needles right next to like the edge of the throat, so it's nice.
So it may have a free arm, but it's not really free. You will be all
suffocated in there.
Yeah.
Well, pretty cool. So I'm excited to get going on the video. Terry, I know you're going to show them some really great stuff, and hopefully we'll do some more videos like this with all of our free time.
Yes. Today what I'm going to do is show you how to fuse our binding on and get a nice machine quilted stitch. So what I'm first going to do is actually attach my binding to the quilt just like I normally do with a 1/4 inch, and I'll show you how I folded the edges here when I actually sew the entire binding on with the serger. But I've just attached this because one of the things that you'll have to remember about the fusible thread is that when you apply heat to it, it disappears. And so if I would just do a 3-thread overlock with my bottom bobbin stitches with fusible thread, this regular stitch will just come out and my binding will just kind of be hanging loose, and that's not a good thing. So what I did was I just did my traditional binding, and I'll show you how I do that here in a minute. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to just place the quilt underneath my overlock, and I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam here, and the two fusible threads are going to overlock or blend right on the edge of this quilt. And we're going to lift the foot, place our quilt under, and we'll start right on the edge. And lay my foot down. And that's just adjusting for all my tensions here. And so now I'm just going to slowly serge right down the edge. And so if you can see, I can go pretty fast. So we have some high-speed needles in there right now. And so I'm just going to come right up at the edge and then off the side. So if you look right on the edge, you'll see the white thread, and that's our fusible thread. And so what I would do is go around the entire quilt and apply all my fusible thread. So if you look here, I've stopped right at the 1/4 inch mark, so I didn't interact with my binding here at all. And so I'll still be able to fold that back and get the mitered corner. So what I'm going to do here again is I'm just going to lift my foot, and I'm going to start right on the edge and sew right up on the inside of my regular stitched binding line. And it's just right on the edge. And so the nice thing about this serger is I can start off the fabric or on. It still behaves the same and forms a good stitch. And so I'm just going to come all the way down like so. And this is not sped up either. So you know, I'm actually sewing this fast, and you can actually do that on a serger. And so once I'm at the end, I'll pull out and chain up. And so I'll continue to do that on all 4 sides of my quilt. So we've got the fusible thread right on the side, and I have an iron that's been heating up. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to slightly push this back with my fingers. I can use my little seam roller, or I can just use my finger to get a nice crease there. But all I have to do is just push back on my iron. And as I apply heat, it's fused. See that? So it's actually fused to my quilt, and I can go all the way around as I go. And so if you're a hand binder, this technique will also work, but instead of having all those clips and pins, what we're going to have is this actually fused to our quilt. And then I'm going to turn it, and I'm just going to show you this. And so I will push that back, and it wraps to the back, and then I will come over here and do this side. And you're just going to apply the heat of your iron down, and you'll see that it's got a nice creased edge on the thing. And then you'll flip over your quilt, and we'll do the exact same thing. Now, if you're going to stitch in the ditch machine binding wise, you want to make sure that this edge is pushed about 1/8 of an inch past your seam line here. So we'll push this just like so, and then I will hold my iron. And so as I'm ironing that, I'm pulling this next section here. And it's there. And now if I want to hand stitch, I can just do my hand stitching like normal, but I don't have any pins where I've stuck it in there and did all that. And then the other thing is, if I want to do this machine binding wise, I'm going to switch this right into my sewing machine. I'm going to put my in the ditch foot on, and I'm going to use monofilament and stitch right in that ditch, and it's going to catch this on the back side. Okay, so I have a couple samples that I can show you. And so right here you'll see that I got that nice crisp 1/4 inch binding. Okay, and then on the front I used monofilament, so you can't really see it, and I top stitched right through here. And so that way the front looked nice. I have my mitered corners right here. This one's a really nice one. And then on the back side I have finished nice edge. This one, because the samples, I didn't know which side was actually the front side, so this one, you can see a little straight stitch right there. That's my 100 weight thread. And then on top, again, is my monofilament and my nice mitered corner. So right here, you can see that I've top stitched this down and did the end of ditch. And so it's caught on the back side. So either which way is going to work. And so we're going to do more lessons on getting that perfect binding. And remember that if you do Stitchhouse and Jackie, you'll find all her binding videos and how to finish the edges and stuff. So I'm going to switch over and I'm going to show you how to do the entire binding onto the quilt, so you can decide if you want to hand stitch, hand bind it, or if you want to machine bind it. And I'll be back in just a second. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use the serger to apply our entire binding onto the quilt. And you know how when you get to the corner, you always want to try to stop about a 1/4 inch so you don't get that bulk in the corner, and you're able to get a nice mitered edge. So to do that, you're going to have to do a technique here at the turnaround. So I'm going to open this up here so you can see closely. There's a little thing right here. It's the stitch finger. O for ordinary sewing and R for rolled hem. So right now, with this engaged to ordinary sewing, the stitches are forming right over that little metal part. So that when I move this back, the little finger comes all the way out and the stitches fall off. When I have this frontwards, the stitches are created over that. So when we have this all closed and we start to stitch, and it tells me I gotta put my foot down, it's actually creating the stitches right here. So I'm gonna see if I can get that a little closer. Okay, so right here is ordinary and rolled hem, and so the actual stitch forms over a little finger right there that slides back and forth. So if you have a serger, you want to pull that frontwards and backwards. And while I'm putting my binding on, you're going to hear me saying I'm going to move it to the rolled hem, release my stitches, and then engage into ordinary sewing again. And so the finger actually goes back and forth, and that's what actually creates our chain, is right over our little stitch finger. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So here's my traditional binding. I have these strips cut at, I usually do it 2.5 inches, but I found for a nice tight binding on the serger, I'll do it at 2.25 inches. And then on the very beginning of it, I have ironed a 45-degree in my fabric, and then that is going to be the beginning of my binding. So if you check out Jackie's binding video, you'll see that this is very similar to the way that she places her binding on her quilt. and this is going to create our finished edge right here. So you'll see that when we swing around the other side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this on my very artistic, wonderful sample, quilted by someone at the store, not me. So we're going to place this halfway onto our quilt and lift my foot, slide so the blade is right at my edge, and I have the blade length set at 6 millimeters. That is a 1/4 inch, and so I'm going to lower my foot and I'm going to stitch frontward. Now this is a 3-thread overlock stitch, and I'm just going to sew frontwards about 3 or 4 inches, and then once I get down here a little bit, I'm going to just sew off to the side. Alright, so we got this nice little 1/4 inch finished edge, and notice also how I've gotten rid of all my little fuzzies and threads and stuff that are hanging off there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this back over and just do my traditional binding here. So I'm going to start where I finished right here. I'm going to lift my foot, move over to my blade 6 millimeters, lower my foot again, and now I'm going to sew right to about a 1/4 inch from the edge. Now you can mark this or you can eyeball it, and I usually just eyeball it. So I'm going to sew frontward, and you see I'm cutting off my little fuzzies. And what I'm going to do is when I get to about a 1/4 inch, I can actually have this machine stop with the needle down. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to raise my needle, and I'm going to, so if I try to turn this, all those stitches are still stuck on the machine and I can't do a nice corner. And so whenever I do corners, I do this simple trick. I'll pull my stitch finger from ordinary sewing to rolled hem, and now it comes right off. Okay, so now I'm going to do what I normally do is I fold my bindings straight north. It creates a 45-degree angle here, and then I fold it straight south, and right up here you'll see a 90-degree angle, a nice little fold. That little fold there is going to be what's going to be put right into the machine here. And ordinary sewing, so we can get those stitches to form again. I'm going to lower my foot and I'm going to start again, and I'm going to sew all the way to the end. So notice how I'm cutting all those little fuzzies off. So if I'm going to hand bind this, it's going to have a nice finished little edge there. Normally I try to stay not cutting off that material, but I'm going to move right up to that 1/4 inch part, move my stitch finger to rolled hem. It's going to release my stitches, so it'll just come right off there. I can take my binding. Instead of coming down like this, I'm going to fold it straight up into a 45-degree angle, and then straight south here. I'm going to slide this back in, put it right on the edge, and I'm going to start sewing again. First I'm going to put this into ordinary sewing. If you don't do that, you'll get a rolled hem and your little binding will be like 1/8 of an inch, and you want to have that 1/4 inch. So put your little ordinary sewing button on, and notice how quickly this goes on, and you're just going to go right down the edge. I'm going to get to the end here, get close to my little 1/4 inch again, stop, rolled hem, lift my foot, my quilt comes off. I can do a 90-degree angle here. I'm going to fold straight up, and then I'm going to fold straight back. And this is how I normally do it on the sewing machine. The only difference here is that I am able to do it much faster. And so if you're one of those people who don't like to do binding, doing it here is much faster. Ordinary sewing, get your stitch finger there and sew. And so we've got one more corner to do, and try to not cut too much of your fabric off, and just shoot for the fuzzies. 1/4 inch here, and one last corner. So I'm going to pull this to rolled hem, release my stitches, pull this around. I'm going to fold that straight up, get a 45-degree angle right there. You can use your little seam roller or roll back and forth with your finger. That'll heat it up a little bit to get you a good crease. I'm going to put this at 90 degrees here, and then I'm going to slide right back in here. Ordinary sewing, and then I'm going to stitch again. So here we go, frontwards. Anything that's extra you can cut off. And so what I'm going to do now is come here, and so I'm going to tuck this piece in so I can have a nice finished miter there, and I'm going to cut it back to where we started sewing right here with the serger. So we've got a finished edge here, and then we started sewing there. I'm going to lay this binding right over the top, and I'm going to get right about 1/4 inch, 1/8 of an inch away from that little thing. And I'm going to take my scissors and cut this right across. This edge doesn't have to be finished because it's going to be tucked into here. And also notice I don't have to like find 2 angles to sew together and finish it. So on the serger I can do it much faster this way. I'm going to tuck this in like so, and I'm going to get this edge to be right at the edge of my binding here, and so that way I'll get a nice tight flat little edge right there. And so if you need to put a pin in there or something, you can. I'm just going to start sewing, and I'm just going to sew right to this place where I have finished, a little over the edge, chain off, and that's my edge. So when I fold this over, I have a nice little finished edge right there. I will sometimes hand stitch or whip stitch this part here if I wanted to. It's not that big of a space that this is going to pull out or anything. But notice also that we did this on the serger, and I still have my mitered corners on the edges. So now all I have to do is pull it to the back. I can hand stitch it. If I sewed this binding onto the back, I could pull this over to the top, and I could just stitch right along this and do my binding like that. Or if, since I did this on the front, I can pull it back, I can whip stitch. But if I pull it back far enough, about 1/8 of an inch past this seam line, I can top stitch right here and it'll catch my binding. Okay, so that's how I will put on my binding on the serger. And so I can fold this right back, and then fold this right there, and then I have a mitered corner. So you've seen how I actually will apply the binding on with the serger, and these 2 samples were done exactly that way with our mitered edges, and we top stitched and we stitched and ditched the binding. So what I would do to get a more closer view and see how to do that is YouTube search Stitchhouse and Jackie, Jacque, And that is where you're going to be able to get a little more up close and personal about how to finish your binding. And we will have more store samples, and we shall see you soon.